So the first thing that I've done is I've just put a little bit of Prussian blue hue, which is number 134, and processed cyan, which is number 120 in the range, and I've just put them into my makeshift palette, and I've put some white in there as well so that I can mix. Other thing we need to do is obviously put some water into our jug. Again, I just recycle my little water jugs. These are just things like a nice chicken tonight jar, or some pasta sauce jars. There's all kinds of things. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start laying in the background, because with acrylic paint it's a medium which you can layer. So once it's dry we can work over the top. So I want to mix my colour first, so I'm going to mix an area down here of a kind of lightish blue, and I'm not going to be too precious about how I lay this down. And I'm using just this brush here, which looks like a 1.5 inch flat brush. This is actually a Wilko household paint brush. If you've taped the corners down, don't forget to just work underneath them, otherwise you'll end up with unfinished corners on your work. If your paint's too thick, just give it a little spritz with the water. Now we want this painting to look quite lively, so we're not going to worry about having things really smooth and mixed. We want to see the brush strokes. That's what's going to make it interesting. So it's not kind of really lifelike. If you look at the reference photograph, it's a bit more white here. So we want this lively brushwork, and the point of this exercise is to stop you getting too sort of hung up and too precious on brush strokes and making things appear perfect. It's trying to kind of give you an idea of how to paint in a loose style. And when we work quite loosely, we often use larger brushes, and the reason being, not only do they cover more ground, which is a good thing, they also stop you from being really precious about your brushwork. And as a beginner we can get quite hung up on detail and making things look lifelike, and there's all kinds of things that sort of go on when you're a beginner. And often when you study at degree level, the first thing your tutor will tell you is, you need to loosen up, you need to loosen up, you need to loosen up. And you think, what on earth are they talking about? I don't understand. It took me a long time to get it when I studied. I'd always be told, work more loosely, and I'd be thinking, what do you mean work more loosely? There's kind of a tendency to be a little bit perfectionistic about things and wanting to get things right, and we can get a bit hung up on that when we start to paint, and it kind of takes all of the lively experimentation out of the work, which is kind of a shame, because it should be fun, right? It should be a fun process. What I might do here actually is to just switch down to a slightly smaller brush for my clouds. So this is a much smaller, this is actually a Boldmere 60. So where was I? Yes, lively painting and not being too precious. And it's nice to use these sort of square, angled brush strokes. It's quite nice to sort of have an opportunity. I can always lay white over the top of this, by the way, once this layer is dried. So yeah, enjoy the opportunity to just kind of work in a loose way, not get hung up on detail, not worry about getting it right. It's more a question of experimenting and learning during the process. It's always handy to have some rag nearby when you paint, so I usually opt for something like that, which is just a cheap pound shop roll, which is useful. Again, stop your paint drying out, and never allow your brushes to dry out with acrylic paint on, because you will ruin them. If you're not going to be going back to your brushes for a while, then just put them in your water, in your paint water in the jar. So I think in order to make the clouds a lot whiter there, I'm going to allow that layer to dry, because it's just mixing and blending on the page. All we're doing at the moment is we're just, you know, blocking in the background, we're making an underpainting, and we can kind of go back over and perfect it later. So when I come down here, I want to get rid of this blue. I'm actually going to take my own advice and put this brush in my water now before I forget it. And I'm going to use a second palette so you can see it more clearly. I'll use a new one. And we're going to start mixing our greens and some of our darker values. So we don't need to worry too much about working green over blue because they're what we call analogous colours, so they're similar. They're not going to create mud or ruin the painting. So this is where we kind of move more into the earthy tones down here. Oh, now one thing I forgot to mention, sometimes your old tubes will get blocked. So just take a bamboo skewer or something similar and just get rid of the dried up crusty paint on the surface. If it's really stubborn like this is, you might need to take a pair of scissors, mind your fingers, and just twist it and see whether that paint's got any life left in it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. This is quite an old tube, but that goes to show that, you know, this is probably, I was just thinking actually, this is probably 2014, so it's a good 6-7 years old now, and it's still usable. So there you go, there's the crusty stuff in the lid that stops you from closing your lid properly and ruining your paint. You can always wash this in warm water, by the way, if it's a real problem. Not this part, just this part. Anyway, I digress. I'm going to water that down a little bit because it is quite crusty and quite thick. So when you rinse your brush in the water, just give it a wipe with the cloth. So here I'm going to use some, I've mixed in sap green, which is 375. I'm going to use some Payne's grey, which is 065. That's my darkest value. And then the one I was just struggling with is actually, I'm not sure they make it anymore, it's called Autumn Yellow and it's number 690. I think it might have got jettisoned when they changed the range, but I might be wrong. But something similar to that, you don't have to worry. Or you could just mix a yellow with like maybe a yellow and a kind of a light brown would make this type of an ochre-y colour, which is what it is essentially. Right, so I'm going to put these dark values underneath. So using this smaller brush, we want to think about the direction that we're moving the brush in. So we want this to be quite angular and quite loose. We'll come to the tree later and we'll be doing the tree in a very similar colour to this, or perhaps this colour. Haven't decided yet. And then without washing my brush I can go straight into that green. You can make dabbing motions with the brush as well, particularly if you're getting those kind of broken edges like this. So we want to kind of blunt it up and just make it look a bit more effortless. And we also want to get some of those really nice lively brush marks in there. The more paint you use, the more you load your brush like this, the more it's going to be very thick on the surface. The thicker it is on the surface, the more textured it looks. So if you like that look, you can experiment with that. It will take longer to dry, so just be aware that obviously the thicker the paint, the longer it's going to take to dry. Right, let's give that a bit of a wash and a bit of a wipe. And then again, because these colours are analogous, I'm going to use this. I really like this colour. This is pale olive green, which is number 368. And I use this a lot actually. It's just a really nice green colour. I really like that. Green's not my favourite colour, I have to confess, but I do like that shade of green. So we can just lay this over the top. And we're just going for a bit of a kind of rough foliage look. Some of this will get painted over, so don't worry too much. So yeah, just be really loose with your brush strokes. Don't worry about worrying if it looks like grass or if it looks like a bush or any of that stuff. And we can also start to work downwards from here as well. We've got slightly lighter values in this foreground, but while we've got the colour mixed on the palette, we can still use some of that. And there's a really nice mix in this painting of different types and different shades of green, which is nice. You don't have to be too precious about where you're poking your brush and whether you've washed your brush. You just have fun at this stage. And if you don't like what you create at this stage, you can treat it as an underpainting and just paint over the top of it. You might find that, you know, you get more contrast or it comes to life more if you add another layer on top. And you know, you can have fun mixing these colours either on the palette or on the page. It's not a problem. Don't forget your corners. Probably should have said at the beginning, you should be wearing your apron. You should have protected your work surface, because acrylic paint is permanent once it dries, and it can be quite tricky to remove from surfaces. So just be a little bit careful if you've made a start and you haven't protected the area. And where you get this light over dark, or you get light, dark over light, that's where you start to build your contrast and your composition starts to look quite interesting. It's actually a really nice teal colour down here, which I'm going to attempt to emulate by using my palette with my blues, and I'm going to mix a little bit of green into there to create a kind of turquoisey, tealish green. That's a lovely shade. So you can always use up some of the paint that's already on your palette. Don't worry about experimenting, because that's what it's all about at this stage. And angle your brush different ways as well, so get some really nice kind of diagonal shapes in there too. Or even what we call like printing or stamping with the brush, which is literally where you load the brush and then you just lay it down. Or pouncing, where you do that repeatedly. Try some different movements with your brush. So that's looking quite interesting, I would say. And I mean interesting in a good way. Not as in, that's really interesting. You sometimes show somebody something, you go, that's interesting. And you think, that's not much of a compliment, is it? But then you get, that's interesting. Note the different tone of voice. They have different connotations. I've got a nasty little chunk in this bit here, so I'm going to pull that out on my palette. And this is actually quite a nice thick texture as well, so I can exploit that texture. And again, I might end up painting over some of this. We shall see. Go into my corner again. You want to make sure you can't see any of the white of the paper surface showing through. So this is the time, if you want to adjust your brush strokes, you can. If you want to just kind of like pull paint around because you don't think it's looking interesting enough, or you want to add something to it, now's the time while it's still wet and therefore movable and malleable. Give that a good wash off. So I would say that's kind of the underpainting for this stage of the painting kind of completed. And as I say, you know, feel free to just have a mess around with your colours and mix things around. I haven't done a lot of mixing because I've got some quite nice colours already. The other thing you might want to have a go at, and I'm not going to do it myself because it's not really part of this project, but when the paint is wet, you can always use sgraffito, which literally means scratching out. So if you wanted to add texture into your wet paint, you could always make kind of grassy scratches into that texture and really kind of like play with that texture. If you don't have something like this, you could use the end of a brush even. Just take a smaller brush. You can always use a brush end. It's a bit more blunt, but it will achieve a very similar effect. I wouldn't recommend using a craft knife or scissors because you might go through your paper, and that's obviously not what we want. We don't want ruined canvases. I often watch Bob Ross actually. I know it's all a bit old hat now. and he does paint in oil. But he frequently uses palette knives, but he never warns his students about going through the canvas, and he sometimes kind of attacks the canvas, and I can imagine the students painting along at home going, whoops, that's torn it, as the end of the palette knife, which is quite sharp, goes through the canvas. So yeah, you have to be a little bit careful with things like that. Okay, so I'm going to leave this to dry now, and then I'm going to come back and work on the second layer.